72-year-old Maggie Thorne stood on the curb and watched a young man in a blue work shirt change the locks on the front door of her home. But what her ex-husband Richard did not know, what he was too arrogant to realize when he handed her the deed to a condemned timber mill, was that he had just handed her the key to his own undoing. The miracle she found hidden within those rotting walls would soon rewrite the laws of the entire valley. If you have ever been treated like a stranger in your own house, if you have watched someone you built a life with turn into a predator, or if you have ever stood alone with nothing but your dignity, this story is for you. Subscribe now, because the justice Maggie found at the bottom of a dry creek bed is something you have to see to believe. The morning air was thin and sharp. Maggie gripped the handle of her suitcase until her knuckles turned the color of the frost on the lawn. She felt the small, heavy weight of the brass, drafting compass in her coat pocket. It had been the first tool she bought for Thorne Construction 40 years ago. She had sold her grandfather's 30-acre woodlot in 1978 to buy the first bulldozer Richard ever owned. She spent 3 decades sitting in a corrugated metal trailer, handling every invoice and every payroll tax, while the company grew into a giant. She never once asked for a paycheck, because she believed the growth of the business was the same thing as the growth of her own future. She had sewed her own dresses for every corporate gala to ensure the company could afford the new hydraulic lifts Richard wanted. She had been the silent architect of a multi-million-dollar empire that was now represented by a single suitcase on a cold sidewalk. The front door opened. Richard walked out wearing a suit that cost more than Maggie's first car. He did not look at her face. He looked at the suitcase. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy iron key tied to a piece of dirty twine. He held it out, but did not move toward her. He waited for her to come to him. "We're just being realistic, Maggie," he said. His voice was smooth and practiced. "At your age, you can't manage a house this size alone. This is what's best for everyone." Maggie took the key. The metal was cold and smelled of rust. Richard checked his gold watch and adjusted his cuffs. He looked past her toward the street, where a black car was waiting. "It's a clean break," Richard continued. "The mill is yours. It's what you always said you wanted: peace and quiet in the valley. You should have planned better for your own future, but I'm being generous." He turned and walked back into the house. The lock clicked. The sound was small but final. Maggie stood there for a long time. She did not cry. She looked down at the brass compass in her hand, and then at the iron key. She walked toward her old sedan parked at the curb. The interior of the car smelled of peppermint and old upholstery. She opened her wallet. She had $42.16 in cash. Her bank account had been frozen since the previous Tuesday. She looked at the address scribbled on the back of a legal envelope: Blackwood Mill. It was a place Richard had called a tax write-off for 20 years. It was a place he said was fit for nothing but termites and shadows. She turned the ignition. The engine groaned before it caught. She shifted into gear and pulled away from the house she had cleaned and loved for 40 years. She did not look in the rear-view mirror. She drove toward the edge of the city. The buildings grew smaller, and the trees grew taller. The road began to wind. She thought about the office trailer. In the early 80s, she remembered the smell of diesel and the sound of Richard's laughter. When they landed their first municipal contract, she had been the one who stayed up until 3 in the morning to find the errors in the bidding documents. She had been the one who convinced the bank to give them a second chance. Now she was a line item that had been erased. The rain began to fall as she reached the valley floor. It was a gray, persistent drizzle that blurred the mountains. She saw the sign for the turnoff. It was faded and leaning at an angle. The gravel crunched under her tires. The road was narrow and hemmed in by thickets of blackberry vines. They clawed at the sides of her car like fingers. She saw the roof first. It was a jagged line of gray shingles against the dark green of the pines. The mill sat low against the creek. It looked like an old animal that had gone into the woods to die. The windows were boarded up with plywood that had turned black from the moisture. The water wheel was missing half its paddles. It stood frozen in the stagnant pool. Maggie parked the car and stepped out. The mud was deep and pulled at her shoes. She walked toward the heavy oak door. She felt the weight of the iron key in her pocket. Her knees ached from the drive. Her lower back felt like a hot wire was being pressed into the bone. She stood in front of the door and listened. There was no sound but the rain. She reached for the handle. Her hands were trembling. She had to use both hands to fit the heavy key into the lock. It did not want to turn. She leaned her shoulder against the wood and twisted with everything she had left. The mechanism groaned. The bolt slid back with a heavy thud. Maggie pushed the door open. The air that rushed out was cold and smelled of wet earth and ancient dust. She stepped inside. She was still here. Margaret Thorne, 72 years old, stood in the center of the rotting floorboards and felt the weight of 40 years pressing against her chest. The air inside the mill was thick with the scent of damp sawdust and the cold metallic tang of stagnant water. She reached into her coat pocket and felt the cool, familiar edge of the brass drafting compass. It was a relic of a time when she believed that hard work was a form of insurance. She had been 22 years old when she handed back her nursing scholarship because Richard had found a backhoe in a junkyard and needed the deposit money. She took the $300 she had saved for tuition and put it in his hand without a second thought. She spent the next decade working as his lead estimator and secretary without ever asking for a title or a paycheck. She spent her nights teaching herself contract law from library books while she breastfed their daughter in a trailer that shook whenever a truck passed. She walked to the grocery store in the shifting snow to save 5 cents on bus fare so the business could afford a new set of tires. She did it all without a single complaint because she believed the empire they were building belonged to both of them equally. She remembered the night in 1989 when the river had flooded their first major construction site. She had stood in hip-deep water beside Richard for 6 hours while the rain turned the world into a grey blur. They were sandbagging the generator that kept the pumps running. He had kissed her cheek and called her his lucky charm and promised that one day they would have a house that overlooked the entire valley. She had felt like a queen in a muddy yellow raincoat because she trusted the man who held the shovel. She believed that every hour of labor was a brick in a fortress that would protect her when she was old. She had been the one who caught the accounting errors that saved the company from bankruptcy in the '92 recession. She had been the one who stayed up until dawn redrafting the bids that won them the state highway contract. She never asked for her name to be on the masthead because she thought her name was already written in the heart of the family. The ordinary details of her life before the divorce now felt like a dream from another person's biography. She used to wake up at 6 and deadhead the roses in the garden of the mansion Richard had finally built. She remembered the specific sound of the porcelain teacup hitting the saucer and the way the morning light turned the marble countertops to gold. She had a routine that involved silver polish and silk curtains and the quiet confidence of a woman who had earned her rest. She had spent 40 years being the foundation of a structure she was no longer allowed to enter. She was 72 years old, and the only thing she had left of that foundation was the tarnished brass compass in her pocket. She walked toward the back of the mill, where a massive wooden gear sat frozen in its tracks. The wood was silvered with age and covered in a fine lace of spider webs. She looked at her hands. They were thin, and the skin was like parchment, but the grip she had on the compass was firm. She had spent her life measuring the distance between where they were and where they wanted to be. She had always been the one to find the center, to find the balance point, while Richard was the one who pushed for more. He had pushed her right out of her own life. He had used the very legal loopholes she had helped him navigate to ensure she was left with nothing but this ruin. She looked at the ceiling where a single beam of light pierced through a hole in the cedar shingles. The dust motes danced in the air like tiny sparks of gold. She thought about the nursing degree she never finished, and the life she had traded for a company that had discarded her like a piece of faulty equipment. Richard had told her she was being practical. He had told her that he was being generous by giving her the mill. He had said she would be more comfortable here, away from the stress of the city and the eyes of their old friends. He had said it with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Maggie moved deeper into the shadows of the ground floor. Every step she took echoed against the stone walls. She felt a sudden, sharp pain in her hip that made her stop and lean against a support beam. She closed her eyes and breathed in the smell of the valley. It was the smell of her childhood, before the bulldozers and the contracts and the betrayal. She opened her hand and looked at the compass. The needle was steady. It was pointing toward the back wall where the water from the creek seeped through the stones. She was 72 years old, and she was standing in a condemned building with $40 in her pocket. She had no plan. She had no home. She had nothing but the truth of what she had built. The water outside continued to rush over the broken wheel. It was a constant, rhythmic sound that reminded her of a heartbeat. She took a deep breath and pushed herself away from the beam. She had to find a place to sleep before the sun went down. She had to figure out how to survive the night in a place that the world had forgotten. The conference room on the 42nd floor was a desert of glass and polished chrome. Maggie sat on a chair that felt like it was made of frozen leather. The air conditioner hummed with a low, aggressive precision that made the hair on her arms stand up. Richard sat across from her. He looked at a folder on the table as if he were studying a blueprint for a bridge he didn't intend to build. His attorney, a man with teeth too white for his age, leaned back and tapped a heavy gold pen against a yellow legal pad. The sound was rhythmic and sharp. It reminded Maggie of a clock ticking toward an ending she couldn't stop. "Maggie, we're worried about you," Richard said. He reached out and adjusted the knot of his silk tie. "At your age, you can't manage a house of that size alone. The taxes alone would swallow you in 6 months. We're just being realistic here." Maggie looked at the silver tray in the center of the table. It held a crystal pitcher of water and 4 glasses that hadn't been used. She watched a single bead of condensation roll down the side of the pitcher. It moved slowly until it hit the tray and vanished into a small, cold puddle. She thought about the garden she had planted 3 years ago. The hydrangeas would be blooming now. She wondered who would water them when the heat of July arrived. She looked at Richard's hands. They were clean and manicured. They didn't look like the hands that had once gripped a shovel in the mud beside her. "This is what's best for everyone," Richard continued. He didn't look her in the eye. "We're not being cruel, we're being practical. You need a clean break so you can focus on yourself. For once." Richard's phone buzzed on the table. He didn't pick it up. The screen lit up with a notification from a woman named Elena. The message said, "Is it done yet? The flight leaves at 6. Richard casually flipped the phone face down. He did it with a smooth, practiced motion that told Maggie he had done it many times before. He looked back at the legal documents, as if the message had never existed. The attorney cleared his throat and slid a thick stack of papers toward Maggie's side of the table. The paper felt heavy and cold. Maggie's own lawyer, a young woman from a legal aid clinic, who had 3 other cases that afternoon, whispered that this was the best deal they could get. She told Maggie that the prenuptial agreement Richard had forced her to sign 10 years into their marriage was ironclad. She said that fighting it would only leave Maggie with legal bills she could never pay. The mansion to Richard, the Thorne construction empire to Richard, the investment portfolios to Richard. While he checked his gold watch and adjusted his silk tie, Maggie received what they called the separate property residue, a condemned timber mill, and $42.16 in cash. "You're not getting nothing," Richard said. He sounded almost offended that she hadn't thanked him. "You're getting a property. It's land, Maggie. It's what you always said you wanted, a place in the valley." He leaned forward then. The smell of his expensive cologne filled the space between them. It was a scent that didn't belong to a man who had ever worked for a living. It belonged to a man who bought things and broke them when they became inconvenient. "You should have been more financially responsible, Maggie," he said. His voice dropped to a low, cold vibration. "This is what happens when you live your whole life without thinking ahead. You can't expect me to pay for your lack of planning forever." The attorney handed Maggie a pen. It was heavy and made of black resin. Maggie looked at her signature on the bottom of the last page. Her hand didn't shake. She wrote her name in the same firm script she had used to sign 40 years of construction bids. She felt the brass compass in her pocket. It pressed against her thigh like a silent witness. She thought about the nights she had spent calculating the cost of gravel and rebar. She thought about the nursing scholarship she had burned to buy his first machine. "I hope the flight is on time, Richard," Maggie said. Her voice was quiet. It didn't carry any anger. It didn't carry any plea for mercy. It was the voice of a woman who was looking at a stranger and finally seeing him for exactly what he was. Richard froze for a fraction of a second. He didn't look at her. He gathered the signed documents and stood up. He smoothed his suit jacket and nodded to his attorney. "We're done here," Richard said. He walked out of the room without looking back. His attorney followed him, talking about a lunch reservation at a club Maggie had never been allowed to join. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut. The sound echoed in the empty room. Maggie sat there for a minute, looking at the empty glass in front of her. She stood up slowly. She walked to the window and looked out at the city she had helped build. The door clicked shut behind her. Maggie sat in the driver's seat of her sedan in the corner of a grocery store parking lot. The windshield wipers moved back and forth with a rhythmic, protesting squeak. She stared at the phone sitting in the cup holder. The screen was dark. She pressed the button to wake it up. No missed calls, no new messages. She had left 3 voicemails for her son, Stephen, and 2 for her daughter, Claire. Neither had called back. They were likely already at the house, helping Richard pack for his trip to the coast. She reached into her purse and pulled out her wallet. She emptied the contents onto her lap. There were 2 $20 bills, 2 single-dollar bills, a dime, a nickel, and a penny. $42.16. That was the liquid value of Margaret Thorne. She had built a company that turned over $10 million a year. Now she didn't have enough to stay in a motel for more than one night. Barnaby, an 11-year-old golden retriever with a coat the color of dried wheat, sighed in the passenger seat. He had been a gift to Richard 5 years ago, but Richard had never learned the dog's name. During the final walkthrough of the house, Richard had pointed at the dog and told the movers to leave the rug behind. Barnaby had followed Maggie to the car without a single look back at the front door. He rested his graying muzzle on her thigh now. He looked up at her with eyes that were clouded by cataracts but filled with a quiet, steady patience. Maggie ran her thumb over the brass compass in her pocket. The metal was warm from her skin. She thought about the highway. She could drive toward the coast and try to find a shelter, or she could drive toward the valley, toward the place Richard thought was a graveyard for her dignity. She looked at the heavy iron key sitting on the dashboard. It caught the light of the street lamp and cast a long, sharp shadow against the plastic. She put the car in gear. The transmission clunked. She didn't have enough money for a full tank of gas and a meal. She would have to choose one. She pulled out of the parking lot and turned toward the mountains. The city lights began to fade in the rearview mirror. The rain turned into a heavy mist that clung to the trees. Barnaby shifted his weight and let out a small, soft whimper. Maggie reached over and scratched the soft skin behind his ears. Her hand stayed there for a long time. The only sound in the car was the hum of the engine and the splashing of water against the wheel wells. She watched the fuel gauge needle hover just above the red line. She drove until the pavement ended and the gravel began. The road was narrow and flanked by steep embankments. She didn't see another car for 40 miles. The silence of the woods felt like a physical presence. It was a different kind of silence than the one in the lawyer's office. This silence didn't demand anything from her. She reached the gate of the mill property just as the sky turned a bruised purple. She stopped the car and looked at the black silhouette of the building against the water. It looked like a ghost. She pulled the brass compass out one more time. The needle pointed straight toward the heart of the structure. She was still here. The road narrowed until the trees met overhead like the ribs of a cathedral. Maggie steered the car toward a small cluster of buildings that marked the edge of Blackwood Landing. There was a gas station with 2 rusted pumps and a general store, with a faded blue awning that flapped in the wind. She pulled the car to a stop beside a wooden bench where the paint had long ago surrendered to the weather. Her knees popped as she stood up. She had $38 left after the last tank of gas. She needed a map or a sign that she hadn't driven into a dead end. Barnaby hopped out of the car and immediately trotted toward the store door. He didn't sniff the bushes or chase the local crows. He sat by the entrance and waited. An old man in a denim apron pushed the door open. He had a face like a topographical map and eyes that seemed to see right through the mist. He looked at Barnaby and then looked at Maggie. He didn't ask if she was lost. He didn't ask for her ID. "You're late, Margaret," the man said. His voice was a low rumble like stones moving in a riverbed. "Arthur told me to watch for a woman with a brass compass and a dog that doesn't bark." That was 20 years ago. Maggie froze. She reached into her pocket and gripped the brass tool. Her father, Arthur, had been dead for 2 decades. He had never mentioned this man or this town. In his final years, the man stepped back and held the door open for her. "I'm Frank," he said. "I've been keeping the taxes paid on the mill since your father passed. Richard tried to buy the land 5 times. I told him the owner wasn't interested in selling to a man who didn't know how to build anything but a bill." He handed her a small paper bag containing a loaf of bread and a tin of coffee. He refused the $2 she tried to give him. He told her the mill was exactly where it had always been. He said the valley had a way of remembering people even when they tried to forget themselves. Maggie drove the final mile in a daze. The mill was worse than the photos in the legal discovery. The roof on the eastern side had collapsed. The siding was grey and brittle. It looked like a skeleton of timber, waiting for a final wind to knock it down. But as she stepped onto the porch, she saw something that Richard had missed. Carved into the lintel above the door was a small ivy leaf. It was the exact same pattern engraved on the back of her brass compass. She turned the key in the lock. The door swung open without a sound. She was home. The first night in the mill was a lesson in the weight of silence. Maggie slept on a pile of old moving blankets she found in the trunk of her car. Her knees felt like they were filled with crushed glass every time she shifted her weight. Her lower back throbbed with a rhythmic heat that made it impossible to find a comfortable position. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind whistle through the gaps in the siding. Barnaby pressed his warm, heavy body against her shins. He was the only thing keeping the damp cold from settling into her bones. By the third morning, a routine began to take shape. She woke up when the first grey light hit the water wheel. She boiled water on a small propane camping stove she had salvaged from the back of her closet years ago. She used a bucket to haul water from the creek to scrub the layers of grime from the floorboards. Her hands were swollen and the joints were thick and angry by noon. She had to wrap her fingers in strips of an old dish towel just to grip the broom handle. She didn't have money for cleaning supplies. She used wood ash from the old hearth and vinegar she found in Frank's store to cut through the grease. She spent hours studying the internal mechanics of the mill. She used the brass drafting compass to measure the alignment of the primary gears. She realized the wood wasn't just old. It was petrified. It was stronger than the steel Richard used in his modern high-rises. She found a stash of rusted tools in a wooden chest beneath the stairs. She spent her afternoons soaking them in motor oil she found in the shed. Every movement was a negotiation with her own skeleton. She didn't think about the mansion. She didn't think about the silk curtains. She thought about the next inch of floorboard. Elias Vance appeared on the fourth afternoon. He was a tall man with a slight stoop and a heavy wool cardigan that had seen better decades. He didn't knock. He simply stood in the open doorway and watched her scrub. He carried a toolbox that looked like it had been through a war. "The alignment on the main shaft is out by 3 inches, Elias said. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask why a 72-year-old woman was living in a ruin. He walked over to the gearbox and ran a calloused hand over the timber. He looked at the brass compass sitting on the ledge. He nodded once, as if the object told him everything he needed to know about the woman holding the scrub brush. "I'm Elias," he said. "I worked the structural bids for your father back in '68. He said you were the only one who understood the tension of a load-bearing beam. He spent 2 hours showing her how to grease the bearings, without wasting a drop of oil. He told her his wife had passed 3 years ago, and the silence in his house was too loud to bear. He didn't ask for payment. He didn't offer charity. He offered work. They worked in a shared, heavy silence that felt like a bridge between 2 islands. But the storm that hit on the 7th night broke the rhythm. The wind turned into a sustained roar that shook the mill to its foundation. The section of the roof over the main gear gave way, with a sound like a gunshot. Rain poured into the center of the room. Maggie stood in the dark with a plastic bucket, trying to catch the water that was flooding the very boards. She had spent a week cleaning. She slipped on the wet wood and fell hard. Her hip hit the floor with a dull thud that stole her breath. She lay there in 2 inches of freezing water. She looked at her phone on the nearby crate. The screen was a black mirror. No missed calls. No texts from Claire or Stephen. They hadn't checked on her once. They didn't even know if she was alive. She thought, "I am 72 years old, and I am lying in the mud. I have $38 and a dog that is shivering. I cannot fix a roof. I cannot stop the water." The math of the future was a giant, dark wave that was finally going to pull her under. She closed her eyes and waited for the cold to take the rest of her. This was where it ended. This was what dying alone looked like. Barnaby nudged her hand with his wet nose. He let out a low, persistent whine and began to lick her face. He grabbed the sleeve of her coat in his teeth and pulled gently. Maggie opened her eyes. The brass compass had fallen out of her pocket when she slipped. It lay in the water, caught in a beam of moonlight that pierced through the broken roof. The needle was steady. It was pointing directly at a loose panel in the stone wall behind the water wheel axle. Maggie gripped the floorboards. She pushed herself up, inch by agonizing inch. Her hip screamed. Her hands shook. But she didn't stop. She grabbed a crowbar from the tool chest and limped toward the wall. "I'm not dying in this shed," she whispered to the rain. She swung the bar. The crowbar rang against the stone with a dull, heavy thud. Maggie swung again. She ignored the fire in her hip and the way her vision blurred with every impact. On the fourth strike, the sound changed. It wasn't the flat crack of granite. It was the hollow vibration of wood. She dropped the bar and used her fingers to claw at the loosened mortar. The stones shifted. Behind them sat a small door made of heart pine that had been sealed with thick, black wax. She reached into the cavity. Her fingers brushed against something cold and cylindrical. She pulled it out. It was a brass tube about 12 inches long. It was heavy for its size and capped at both ends. The metal was green with age, but the seal was intact. She sat back on her heels in the shallow water. Barnaby sat beside her. He leaned his shoulder against her arm and watched the tube with a focused, quiet intensity. Maggie's hands were shaking so hard she had to set the cylinder on her lap. She took a deep breath. She could hear the rain drumming on the roof and the creek roaring outside the walls. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass drafting compass. She used the sharp steel point of the needle to pick at the edge of the wax seal. The wax flaked away in brittle, dark chips. It smelled of pine resin and very old dust. She twisted the end cap. It resisted for a moment and then gave way with a soft, pressurized hiss. The air that escaped smelled of 19th century ink and parchment. Maggie reached inside. She felt the crisp edge of paper. She pulled out a roll of heavy cream-colored documents tied with a faded silk ribbon. She unrolled the first sheet. Her flashlight beam danced across the page. The handwriting was elegant and precise. It was a map of the valley dated 1884, but it wasn't a standard land survey. Every blue line representing the creek was marked with specific coordinates and legal annotations. She blinked and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She read the first line again. Riparian rights and perpetual water access. Blackwood Mill and associated waterways. She stared at the words. She didn't move for a long time. She felt the blood rushing in her ears. She looked at the second page. It was a deed signed by the state governor and witnessed by the founding families of the county. It didn't just grant the mill the right to use the water. It granted the mill owner the exclusive legal authority to divert, dam, or tax any commercial usage of the creek for 10 miles upstream and 5 miles down. "Barnaby," she whispered. Her voice was a dry rasp in the empty room. "Look at this." She read it a third time. She looked at the signature at the bottom of the secondary codicil. It was her great-great-grandfather's name. This document had been missing from the county archives for 70 years. Everyone in the valley believed the water rights had been absorbed into the public trust decades ago. Richard certainly believed it. He had based his entire upstream development project on the assumption that the water was free for the taking. She realized the scale of it then. Without this paper, the multi-million-dollar luxury housing complex Richard was building 5 miles north was a collection of dry pipes. Without her permission, he couldn't even fill a swimming pool or connect to the local reservoir. The tax write-off he had dumped on her was actually the most powerful piece of leverage in the entire state. She looked at the brass compass sitting on the floor. The needle was steady. The ivy leaf on the back of the tool matched the watermark on the parchment exactly. Her father hadn't left her a ruin. He had left her a fortress. He had known she would be the only one who knew where to look. He had known she was the only one who would know what the measurements meant. Maggie rolled the papers back up. She tucked them inside her coat, against her heart. She felt a heat rising in her chest that had nothing to do with the storm or the pain in her joints. She stood up. Her hip still ached, but the weakness in her knees was gone. She looked at the broken roof and the flooding floor. She didn't see a disaster anymore. She saw a construction site. "We have work to do," she said to the room. The storm didn't seem so loud anymore. The morning after the storm, Maggie did not wait for the sun to clear the ridge. She sat at the small wooden table with a piece of charcoal and the back of a grocery bag. She used the brass drafting compass to sketch a map of the roof trusses. Her hip was a dull, constant ache, but she moved with a precision she hadn't felt in years. She knew how to calculate the load of a cedar beam. She knew how much tension a rusted bolt could take before it snapped. She spent the first 3 hours of daylight sorting the scrap metal she had found in the shed. She piled the rusted iron into the back of her old sedan until the bumper nearly touched the gravel. She drove to the scrapyard 3 towns over. The man at the scale looked at the 72-year-old woman and then at the pile of century-old hardware. He offered her $64.50. Maggie didn't argue. She took the cash and went directly to a local lumber yard that sold reclaimed materials. She bought 6 sheets of corrugated tin and a box of galvanized screws. She had $12.08 left when she pulled back into the mill's driveway. Elias Vance was already there. He was standing on a ladder, pulling the rotted shingles from the hole in the roof. He didn't ask where she had been. He just pointed to the tin in the back of her car. "I have the hammer," Elias said. "You have the measurements." They worked through the heat of the afternoon. Maggie stayed on the ground, passing tools and checking the alignment of each sheet. She used the brass compass to mark the drill points on the metal. Her hands were stained with rust and grease. The skin was cracked around her nails, but her grip was steady. She felt the rhythm of the work returning to her body. It was the same rhythm she had used to build Richard's empire, but this time the output belonged to her. By the end of the second week, the roof was watertight. The sound of the rain changed from a threatening splash to a rhythmic drumming on the new tin. Maggie moved her blankets from the floor to a small loft she had cleared of bird nests. She scrubbed the stone walls with a mixture of lye and creek water until the hidden masonry emerged. The stone was a deep, cool gray. It held the coolness of the earth even when the afternoon sun hit the valley floor. She spent the third week on the water wheel. She and Elias used a hand-cranked winch to lift the main axle. They cleared 30 years of silt and river stones from the wooden paddles. Maggie used a wire brush to scrub the petrified oak gears. She applied the salvaged motor oil to the bearings with a small brush. She worked until her shoulders burned and her fingers went numb. On a Tuesday afternoon, the clouds broke and the creek rose from a morning shower. Maggie stood by the manual release lever. Elias stood on the bank with a long pole to clear any debris. "Now!" Elias shouted over the rush of the water. Maggie gripped the iron handle. She leaned her weight into it. Her boots slid on the damp floorboards. She felt the resistance of the rusted gears. She thought about the lawyer's office. She thought about the silk tie and the gold watch. She pushed with everything she had left in her 72-year-old frame. The lever moved. A heavy wooden gate slid upward. The creek rushed into the flume with a roar. The water hit the first paddle of the wheel. The massive structure groaned. It shivered as the weight of the river pressed against the oak. Then, with a slow, majestic thud, the wheel turned. The sound vibrated through the floorboards and up into Maggie's boots. It was a deep, rhythmic heartbeat that filled the entire building. Internal gears began to spin. The dust of decades flew into the air and danced in the shafts of sunlight. The mill wasn't a ruin anymore. It was a living machine. Maggie walked to the edge of the water. She watched the wheel dip into the foam and rise again. The wood was dark and glistening. The light caught the spray and turned it into 1,000 tiny diamonds that hung in the air for a second before vanishing. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass compass. She held it up to the light. The needle didn't move. It was locked onto the center of the world. She sat on the edge of the porch and watched the water move. She didn't feel the cold. She didn't feel the ache in her hip. She felt the weight of the building holding her up. Barnaby walked over and rested his head on her knee. He watched the wheel with her. The air smelled of wet stone and clean, moving water. The mill was whole again. It was enough. 72-year-old Maggie Thorne sat on the porch and watched the morning light turn the creek into a ribbon of moving silver. The rhythmic thud of the water wheel was a pulse she felt in the soles of her feet. It was a different kind of vibration than the heavy machinery of the city. This sound didn't demand anything from her. She looked at her hands, which were stained with walnut oil and scarred from the slipped wrench. They were the hands of the woman who had built an empire, but they were also the hands of a woman who was no longer waiting for a phone call that would never come. She pulled the brass drafting compass from her pocket and held it against the morning sun. The ivy leaf engraved on the back caught the light and cast a small, intricate shadow on her palm. She thought about her father, Arthur, and the way he used to smell of cedar shavings and blueprints. She spoke softly to the empty porch, her voice barely a whisper over the sound of the water. "You knew, didn't you?" she said. "You knew he would eventually see the numbers and forget the woman who wrote them." She felt a warmth in her chest that wasn't from the coffee. It was a physical lightness, a loosening of the knot that had lived under her ribs for 40 years. She realized she had spent her life being the scaffolding for another man's monument. Now, the monument was gone, and she was still standing. She wasn't the residue of a divorce settlement. She was the architect of her own survival. She didn't need a mansion to be whole. She needed a roof that didn't leak and a wheel that kept turning. The community began to arrive on a Thursday. It wasn't a formal meeting or a scheduled visit. It started with a woman named Sarah, who drove a truck that sounded like a bag of bolts. She stopped at the edge of the driveway and held up a basket of late-season apples. She said she had heard the wheel turning from the main road and wanted to see if the rumors were true. She didn't ask about Richard. She didn't offer pity. She asked if Maggie knew how to mill heirloom corn. By Saturday, there were 3 cars parked in the tall grass. A young man brought a broken wooden chair and asked if the mill's secondary lathe still worked. An elderly couple from the next ridge over stopped by with a jar of honey and a story about how Maggie's father had helped them survey their land in 1965. They didn't treat her like a victim of a high-profile betrayal. They treated her like a Thorne. They spoke to her as an equal who understood the language of the valley. Maggie opened the doors of the mill to all of them. She didn't charge money. She traded. She exchanged a few hours of lathe time for a bag of flour or a gallon of paint. She taught the young man how to calculate the grain of the wood so it wouldn't split under pressure. She sat with the women on the porch and talked about the weather and the price of propane. They brought their own versions of her story, tales of a woman who had been discarded but refused to disappear. The property began to change under the collective weight of their attention. The blackberry vines were pushed back. The steps were reinforced with salvaged railroad ties. A small garden of herbs appeared near the kitchen door, planted by a neighbor who said the soil there was too good to waste. The mill was no longer a secret or a ruin. It was a landmark. It was a place where things were fixed and stories were kept. Maggie stood in the center of the floor one evening after the last visitor had left. The air smelled of sawdust and honeysuckle. She felt a deep, steady peace that reached all the way to her bones. It was the sensation of a load finally being balanced. She wasn't waiting for the world to give her permission to exist anymore. She was the one holding the compass. She was still here. Richard's black SUV appeared at the edge of the clearing. It moved slowly over the gravel, the tires crunching with a sound like breaking bone. He stopped the car 20 feet from the porch and sat inside for a full minute, watching the water wheel turn. Maggie stood on the porch with the brass drafting compass in her hand. She wore a pair of stained denim overalls and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Her skin was tanned from the sun, and her hands were dark with the grease of the gears. Richard stepped out of the car. He wore a charcoal suit and a crisp white shirt. He looked at the new tin roof and the neatly stacked lumber by the shed. He looked at the neighbors' cars parked under the trees. He did not look at Maggie's face. He looked at the spinning wheel. "Maggie, we've been so worried about you," Richard said. He walked toward the porch, stopping when his leather shoes hit a patch of soft mud. "The kids and I have been talking. At your age, living out here in a condemned building is just not realistic. It's dangerous." Maggie watched him. She did not offer him a seat. She did not offer him water. She felt the weight of the brass compass against her palm. "We're just being realistic, Maggie," Richard continued. He adjusted his silk tie. "I've found a very exclusive community in the city. Private gardens, full medical staff. I'm willing to take the mill back and handle the legal fees to clear the title. It's what's best for everyone. The Grand Thorne project has hit a snag, hasn't it, Richard?" Maggie asked. Her voice was quiet. It was the same voice she used to use when she caught an error in a bridge bid 40 years ago. Richard froze. He looked at the creek and then back at her. "It's a minor municipal issue," Richard said. He tried to sound casual. "The county records are a mess. But we can settle this between us. There's no need to make this harder than it needs to be. We're family, after all. We were family when I sold my land to buy your first bulldozer," Maggie said. "We were family when I ran your billing department for 35 years without a salary. We weren't family in that conference room last month." Richard took a step forward. He reached out as if to touch her arm, but Maggie stepped back. "The 1884 riparian deeds were inside the main axle housing," Maggie said. "Elias Vance has already authenticated the signatures. My attorney filed the injunction this morning." Richard's face went the color of wet ash. He looked at the mill as if it were a monster that had just woken up. "You're not getting nothing," Maggie said, repeating his own words back to him. "You're getting a property. That's what you told me. You told me I should have planned better. Well, my father planned very well. He knew exactly who you were." Richard's eyes narrowed. The concern vanished from his voice. "You think you can win this?" he hissed. "I have a legal team that will tie this up for a decade. You'll be 82 before you see a dime of that water money." "I don't want your money, Richard," Maggie said. "I want the water, and the water says you stop building." Richard looked at the neighbors watching from the edge of the clearing. He looked at the heavy iron key hanging from a hook on the porch post. He realized there was no audience for his performance. There was no judge to sway and no lawyer to bully. There was only a 72-year-old woman who knew exactly what her signatures were worth. "You're being vindictive," Richard said. "I'm being practical," Maggie replied. She turned and walked into the mill. She did not wait for him to respond. She did not look back to see him struggle to turn his luxury car around in the narrow driveway. She went to the gearbox and picked up her oil can. She listened to the sound of the SUV fading into the distance. The door clicked shut behind him. 1 year after the morning she arrived, the valley was heavy with the scent of pine and wet stone. Maggie sat on the porch and watched a blue heron land on the rocks near the flume. The bird stood perfectly still, a silhouette of silver against the rushing water. The legal settlement had been finalized in December. Richard had been forced to redraw his development plans to bypass her waterline at a cost that nearly crippled Thorne Construction. The pipes stayed dry where Maggie said they must. She did not take his money. She took a permanent conservation easement that protected the creek for 50 miles. The mill was no longer a ruin. The stone walls had been repointed and the windows were clear. A small sign hung by the road that read, "Blackwood Community Workshop." Inside, the gears hummed with a low, rhythmic power. Elias Vance was in the woodshop, showing a local teenager how to plane a piece of maple. The sound of their voices carried over the water, a steady murmur of shared knowledge. Maggie had a small, steady income from the heritage grains she milled twice a week for the local bakeries. It was enough for her groceries, her taxes, and a new winter coat for herself. Barnaby lay at her feet, his white muzzle resting on his paws. He was slower now, but his coat was thick and clean. He watched the heron with a lazy interest, his tail thumping once against the porch boards. Maggie reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass drafting compass. She laid it on the wooden table beside her tea. The metal was polished and bright. She didn't need to check the alignment anymore. She knew the heartbeat of the building by the way it vibrated in her chair. She looked up at the ridge, where the old logging road vanished into the trees. She thought about the office trailer in 1978, and the woman who had sold her land for a bulldozer. She didn't feel sorry for that woman anymore. She felt like a stranger to her. She was 73 years old, and for the first time in her life, her name was written on something that couldn't be erased by a signature in a glass office. She picked up the compass and ran her thumb over the engraved ivy leaf. She looked at the water wheel as it dipped into the foam and rose again, catching the light of the setting sun. "I measured it right, Dad," she whispered to the empty valley. "Every single inch." The heron took flight, its wings beating slow and steady against the darkening sky. Maggie watched it until it was a speck against the clouds. She stood up and whistled for Barnaby. It was time to close the gates for the night. The mill stood as a silent witness to a truth that the city had forgotten. We are often told that we are the sum of our bank accounts and the titles on our business cards. We are told that once we reach a certain age, we are meant to fade into the background like old wallpaper. But Maggie Thorne proved that a foundation built on integrity cannot be moved by a lawyer's pen. The water that turns the wheel does not ask for a birth certificate. It only asks for a channel that is strong enough to hold its weight. Maggie looked at the brass compass on the table. It was a small tool, but it had never lied to her. It had pointed her toward the truth when the world was trying to bury her in shadows. She was not a victim of a divorce settlement. She was not the residue of a construction empire. She was a woman who had reclaimed her own history from the vines and the rust. She had proven that justice does not always come from a gavel or a high-rise office. Sometimes, justice comes from a loose stone and a heart that refuses to stop beating. The valley remembered her because she had never stopped building, even when she was building for someone who didn't deserve her labor. Now, the labor was hers alone. The peace she found in the rhythmic thud of the gears was a wealth that Richard would never understand. Maggie stood up and walked toward the heavy oak door. She felt the strength in her legs and the clarity in her mind. She was 73 years old and she was just beginning to see the full design of her life. She was the architect now. She was the owner of the water and the keeper of the wheel. She was finally home. If Maggie's story moved you, if you've ever felt like the years of your life were being treated like someone else's property, this was for you. If you have ever stood in the rain and wondered if the world had forgotten your name, remember the mill. Remember the woman who found a fortress in a ruin. Leave one word in the comments describing the feeling you had when Maggie saw the water wheel turn for the first time, because Maggie's story proves something that is always true. Your value is not determined by the people who failed to see it. You are the only one who can decide when your work is finished. You are the only one who holds the compass to your own future. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their greatest discovery might be waiting right where the world said there was nothing left. Share it with someone who feels like they have been discarded by the people they once trusted. Because together, we prove that dreams don't age.